Guys, thanks for coming. This is Talks at Google. My name's Jason Andreas. I'm here with Dr. Howard Markel, author of the Kelloggs, the Battling Brothers of Battle Creek. This book, actually, 2017 National Book Critics Circle Award finalist for nonfiction. So congratulations on that. The paperback just came out today, as we were just discussing a little bit ago. Let's please give Dr. Markel a big Google welcome. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier. The book is quite thick for those of you that can't see. It's fantastically a detailed recount of the Kellogg brothers. How did you initially become interested in writing this book? Where did the spark come from to kind of dig into these two brothers' lives and really kind of flush it out as much as you have?
Well, this was really a great leap from my previous work, where I've written quite a bit about epidemics, and the book before this one was about Sigmund Freud and his discovery of cocaine,
Sure.
which he liked a little bit too much.
Yeah, we've heard the story.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. He was a wild man. And actually, this project began as a project of convenience, which I've never done before and hopefully won't do after. But I had just injured my back terribly while I was finishing the research for the last book.
Sure.
I injured myself in Vienna and herniated a disc and then a second disc, so I wasn't very mobile. And I knew that John Harvey Kellogg's papers were mostly at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan.
Sure.
So I started playing with them, and I had known about him, but the more I played with the papers and looked at them, I figured, well, there was a book in that life. And the span of time he lived in American history and in American medicine. But as I wrote more and more about the book, I realized that if you told the story of John Harvey Kellogg, the doctor, you had to also tell the story of his little brother, Will Kellogg, the cornflake king, because they worked together for 25 years at the Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Sure.
They co-invented what became cornflakes, and then they ruptured their relationship. And of course, Kellogg's became the world-famous food giant that it is today.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the book is the dynamic between the brothers. You start off by kind of laying a foundation of how they got to the United States and how they settled in Michigan, and really foundationally from a geography standpoint, but then you start to explain how they were each brought up differently. John, for the most part, had a pretty easy path in life, we'll say. He was always kind of the favorite child. Mm-hmm. Everyone who met him said he was this great, intelligent person and went through multiple medical schools, was always kind of lauded in his time, where Will, on the other side, was initially seen as being dim-witted,
Yep.
Which eventually
That's the word his teacher used.
Dim-witted. I know. I don't use that word often in my life.
Yeah.
That's a quote. Which was ultimately kind of attributed to nearsightedness, I believe, eventually.
Which wasn't diagnosed till he was 20.
Which is wild. I know.
Yeah. So imagine that.
And I think that plays into, too, when he eventually started his foundation. A lot of what they do, we'll talk about this a little later, is focused on children's health, kids' health, and eyesight in general
and
as well. Yeah.
ocular or eye health. In
absolutely.
fact, the University of Michigan Kellogg Eye Center,
Absolutely.
That's not by accident.
Sure, of course not. He had a little bit of a harder kind of life where a lot of folks were not as nice to him. Even his parents didn't necessarily treat him as well. He sold brooms for his family, where his brother was off at these fancy medical schools across the country. Yet, when you think of the Kellogg name now, especially, people probably associate more with Will. He's got the kind of the longer legacy that's lasted. How did you go about kind of deciphering the play between the two brothers? And if we transported ourselves back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, John would probably be the more famous of the two.
Absolutely.
Whereas 100 years later plus,
Right.
now Will is kind of the one who's left the longer legacy.
Yes.
How did you go about kind of breaking that apart and really also tying it together as well?
Well, you make a very good point. In real time, John Harvey Kellogg was one of the most famous doctors in America.
Sure.
He was a best-selling author. He lectured all over. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was a very popular place where tens of thousands of people came to this medical resort / spa / grand hotel / hospital, because they did operations and medical treatments and so on. And during that period, Will called himself J.H.'s lackey. And it wasn't until cornflakes became a product that the name Kellogg became synonymous with Will's work. What was great about writing about both these brothers was the conflict. And so as a writer, I love conflict. I don't like it in my own life, but I love it when I'm writing about other people's lives. And it's a great tool that I've used as a literary device for many of my books to go back and forth between two or more people, because it makes the story far more interesting and richer, and it brings the reader, when they're in one place, they want to go to the next place, and so on. So it's a way of holding the interests of the reader, but also of the writer. Because if the writer is not interested in the book, it's very hard to convey that to an audience. So I found their relationship just fascinating, and each of them were remarkable in their own way, and yet they were probably at their best when they worked together, even though they were at their worst when they worked together. John Harvey treated Will very badly. He would make him run around beside him as he rode his bicycle to take notes. If he was having one of his 5 daily bowel movements, the doctor was a big believer in that. He hated constipation. He would make Will come into the bathroom and take dictation. I mean, all these kind of demeaning things. Yeah. He paid him very badly. Will rarely had a day off. And yet Will ran the place beautifully. His great genius was in business, in administration, in process. He had to manage all these people, different types of people, doctors, nurses, orderlies, masseuses, hydrotherapists, cooks, you name it. And so you couldn't find a better place to learn how to run an international corporation like Kellogg's than running the Battle Creek Sanitarium for his brother, Dr. Kellogg.
Sure. I grew up with an older brother, so as I was reading the book, I kept laughing. I was like, geez, I thought my brother was mean to me when I was young. This guy was pretty rough on his brother. But again, ultimately, I love the dynamic, like you said. It's really interesting. It was almost like a script for a movie or something, where you've got the one brother who's super successful, the other who's not, and they kind of end up crossing paths as the story continues. And again, as you said, ultimately they worked best together. Yeah. But ultimately, they also had a difficult relationship as well.
Because their greatest moment, their great eureka moment, was coming up with flaked cereals.
Sure, yeah.
First it was wheat, then it was corn because it was cheaper and tasted better. And then it tasted even better when Will added a little sugar and salt that the doctor was against. But if you think about cornflakes, it changed the way people ate breakfast. Because breakfast was an ordeal. Particularly in era of wood-burning stoves, and when mothers were really the primary homemakers. They would have to get up early to start the fire. They would make, for example, bacon or salted meats or fried potatoes. Or even if you made oatmeal, it was a big to-do. Now you could just simply pour breakfast out of a box. Even Dad could make it. Yeah. So it really, in 1906, when it came out, it took the world by storm.
It's truly revolutionary. Yeah. As simple as, we take it for granted today. I've got 10 boxes of cereal in my pantry, but you don't think about that this was a revolutionary kind of introduction when it came out in the early 1900s.
Yeah, and it was made as a health food. Yeah. It was made for invalids who could not digest their food very easily. And indeed, flake cereals are very easy, perhaps too easy to digest. Yeah. You break it down as soon as you start eating it. And in fact, we know that has what's called a high glycemic index, meaning it raises your sugar, blood sugar, and then your insulin, and then it precipitously goes down, and you're hungry long before noon, before lunch. While a low glycemic index, oatmeal, you stay full or you feel full longer. But Will's brilliant idea was that there's a lot more regular, healthy people who need a nutritious breakfast than sick people who need a health food breakfast.
Sure.
And so that was his brilliance.
Can you talk about, you mentioned this a lot, and this is a recurring theme in the book, is both John and Will's obsession with kind of this healthy lifestyle, which was actually fairly revolutionary at the time too. You lay a foundation early on, as I mentioned, of what kind of a difficult time the late 1800s were, especially when you're living, their family grew up kind of on the west side of Michigan, a little bit on the frontier, and how unhealthy people were at this time, and how they kind of revolutionized this idea of health, right? This idea of wellness, right? Wellness, kind of this all-encompassing, which included things like eating better, but also exercise and fresh air and all of these different
things.
Nicotine,
no alcohol, no caffeine.
Which was a complete U-turn for a lot of people
at the time.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about how they were raised in that era and how they kind of utilized that motivation to
Yeah.
kind of focus their life on this idea of
Yeah.
well-being. Both of them did. Yeah,
Well,
different ways.
and their parents who came from Massachusetts to Michigan really were pioneers. I mean, when they came in the 1830s, they came before Michigan was even a state.
Sure.
It was still a territory.
Yeah.
And one of their brothers describes a wall of trees on either side of a little dirt road that they took, originally to Flint, then to Jackson, and then to Battle Creek. But people ate remarkably badly in the 19th century.
Butter,
Vegetables
lard,
were always cream, a lot
Yeah.
of butter, a lot of lard,
Yeah.
a lot of animal fat.
Yeah.
You would save the grease from dinner to fry up breakfast the next morning. A lot of molasses and syrup and heavily sugared foods. A lot of alcohol. The consumption of alcohol in, say, 1900, if you look at the data, is staggering, which gives you a lot of reasons why people wanted prohibition
Right.
in the late
Out
20s.
of control.
Yeah, and a lot of people smoked and they drank a lot of coffee, a lot of tea. So the American diet was not a good one. Now, the Kellogg's were early acolytes of the Seventh-day Adventist Church,
Yep.
which has a great many edicts. They were based in Battle Creek. Now, one of the most famous is the prediction of the Advent, that the second coming of Jesus Christ and the destruction of the mortal world and the good people going up to heaven. That's what's really well known, but even more intriguing to me as a historian of medicine was the founders of the church, Ellen and James White, their edicts on what they called health reform. So the idea was that your body is a temple. If you want to go to heaven, you not only have to be clean of mind and spirit, but also of body. And so she worked with a lot of people of that era in terms of healthy diets, of wellness, as you said. Dr. Kellogg called it biologic living. But they worked with people like Sylvester Graham of graham cracker fame,
yeah, of
and
course.
that was a whole wheat grain that
Yeah.
he recommended.
Yeah.
And there were many other people, vegetarians and such, who were, they were not the majority, but they were saying this is what we ought to be eating. This is how we ought to be exercising and taking care of ourselves. Spiritually, the issues of worry and not sleeping well, things like that. It's just remarkable how much they suggested. And if you look at the early progress in American public health, it is very intricately tied to Christianity and various sects of Christianity that are telling their flock to take care of themselves.
You also talk about a conflicting idea, though, with the Adventists as well, in terms of since they thought that the Advent was coming and there was this ultimate return of the Creator, that they put kind of a low focus on like higher education,
Yeah.
and lasting education.
Yeah.
Yet coming up in a very religious kind of base, both brothers became kind of revolutionary in the way that they kind of tackled some of these things.
Yeah.
They were kind of difference makers in their fields, where it seems really interesting because they did focus on education, whereas the kind of the religious
Yeah,
that they were part
yeah.
of.
I mean, Will was not educated
Yeah.
beyond grade school because
Right.
his parents thought, "What's the point?"
What's the point? Right,
And
yeah.
a lot of people felt
Yeah,
that in that
yeah,
community.
yeah.
It is interesting, though, that even the whites who are predicting an Advent, they're much more careful than other denominations that are saying the same thing, in that they're not giving a date.
Right. Yeah.
And that was really quite brilliant.
Predicting,
there was one guy,
2022,
William Miller, who
right?
predicted this particular
Yeah,
date. It didn't
yeah,
happen.
yeah.
And
It's good to predict the date if it works. If not,
right, yeah,
basically
yeah.
lose your credibility.
Well, if it works, that's not so good either, considering what you're predicting. But at the same time, the whites were building an empire. They were building churches all over the country, and then later the world. They had missionaries going out to bring more people in. They had a huge publishing company that published a newspaper, Bible tracts, all sorts of things. It's sort of an early Google. They are transmitting information
Sure.
using, 19th century methods of technology, but to spread the word. And John Harvey was sent to good medical schools by the whites. They paid for it because they wanted someone to run what was then called the Western Health Reform Institute, which ultimately became the Battle Creek Sanitarium. So they could see far enough into the future to take care of things that would extend their empire.
Can you talk a little bit about the Sanitarium? Because it's in the story of the Kellogg's. And again, if we shot back to the late 1800s, everyone would know about the Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Yeah.
It hasn't. A lot of folks might not know as much about it. If you say the word Kellogg's, a lot of folks would obviously think about the food brand or the foundation. They wouldn't necessarily think about the sanitarium itself. So you talk a little bit about what the sanitarium was. You talked a little bit about how it started with the whites kind of educating John and bringing him back. But what did that look like back in the day? Why was it such an important part of health and wellness at the time?
Well, it started basically in 1866 as a little house with some quacky doctors and some pretty bad food. They used to give a lot of what was called hydrotherapy, baths of all kinds. But they didn't always have enough water, so sometimes they had to reuse the bath water on different patients, which for some reason was not well received.
Right.
One woman said it's as if we were all dipped into the same gravy. And when John Harvey came back in 1876 from going to Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York City, he said, I'll do it on a couple of conditions. One, that I get to run it as the most modern, medical, and scientifically oriented place I can muster. And two, I don't want any interference from the religious elders. He did not want lay people to tell him how to run his hospital.
Sure.
But he was very, very ambitious, and he kept building on and more to the Battle Creek Sanitarium. It became bigger and better with each passing year. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was the most popular train stop on the Michigan Central Railway between Detroit and Chicago. And as I said earlier, more than 10,000 people a year came there for all sorts of therapies and spas and lectures. He called it a sanitarium. He made that name up. Sanitas, from health, Latin for health, and it was his university of health. It was there not just to be a hospital where sick people were treated, but where people came to be well and to lead healthy lives.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about John's experience in Bellevue, and to go back a little bit about kind of the dynamic of health at the time. You mentioned that the mortality rate at Bellevue Hospital, which was one of the most famous in the country at the time, was 16 or 17%.
Oh, it's huge,
like
yeah.
that. So basically, out of every 100 people who checked in the hospital, only around 80 of them actually
went home.
Yeah. Which, if that happened at University of Michigan, we'd be in a lot of trouble right now, right?
Yeah, I think that. Not you, I would, but you don't work there.
Yeah.
But first of all, so this is 1874.
Yeah.
And think about what medicine had to treat people at that time.
Right.
And the answer is not a whole lot.
Not much, yeah.
And most of hospital care was what we would call today nursing care. There was no IV fluids. That didn't happen until the 1930s. Surgery in terms of antiseptic and then later aseptic surgery, so you don't die of a post-operative infection, was just beginning at the time. So generally an operation could end up in death. And you didn't do a lot of exploratory surgery inside the gut, let alone the chest. It was largely amputations or external procedures. There were very few drugs that would treat diseases, and so people did not live very long and healthy lives, and particularly those who went to hospitals like Bellevue. This was a public hospital for the poor.
Yeah.
The rich would never find themselves at Bellevue Hospital. And so, and there was a distinction of how the poor were taken care of as opposed to how the wealthy. Sound familiar? That's not a problem we have yet solved. But it was not a healthy place to find yourself. And most people, back when John Harvey Kellogg walked the wards of Bellevue, would avoid it at all costs if they could.
You talk about some of the methods for treating diseases, bleeding, use of mercury, and things like that. I mean, you're
arsenic,
strychnine. How could this be possible? But again, 150 years ago, these were fairly
these were standard.
Experimental.
These were standard. And the thing too, what a lot of lay people who don't read a lot of the history of medicine don't understand fully is that while a lot of people were called MD, they graduated from a college that gave them that degree, different schools taught different forms of medicine. So the University of Michigan, for example, taught what's called allopathic medicine, which is still what is practiced, what my MD is in. And that's the notion of medications or drugs and operations and so on.
Yep.
But there were also homeopaths.
Yep.
In fact, University of Michigan used to have a homeopathic medical school from the 1870s to the early 1920s, who taught that infinitesimally small doses of a drug that created the same symptoms of the disease you had would be curative. There were osteopaths, there were botanical doctors, there were eclectic doctors. So not all MDs were alike. And even if you were from the best medical school of that era, what was being taught and what you had in your arsenal was pitifully small compared to today, or even compared to 50 years ago.
I'm glad things have progressed beyond the 1920s when it comes to medicine.
Yeah.
Progressing forward a little bit then, so from the Sanitarium in Battle Creek, where did the kind of invention of cornflakes come to be? How did that progress from kind of this health retreat to now creating what would eventually become the Kellogg's company?
Yeah. Well, John Harvey Kellogg, one of his big pursuits as a scientist was inventing foods. He had a food laboratory, and he thought there are certain healthy or healthier foods. He was a big fan of nuts. In fact, he probably invented peanut butter. People always disagree about that. And his peanut butter was made out of boiled peanuts and didn't taste very good. But he came up with foods that were palatable, because eating mushy, overcooked vegetables or grains is not really attractive. And he wanted people to eat healthy when they left the sanitarium as well as when they were at the sanitarium. And so one of his theories was that if you took a starch in a grain and you cooked it or baked it for a long period of time, you broke down the starch molecules into a simple sugar, dextrose. And he called that dextrinization. And that would be easier to digest. And a lot of people with bad stomachs would come to the sanitarium. I mean, after dyspepsia, stomach aches, constipation, another auto intoxication where pieces of meat were theorized to be festering in your gut and giving off poisons. Sure. They all came to Battle Creek, and so he first fed them double-baked biscuits, Zwieback. And the way the story goes, whether it's true or not, a woman bit into a biscuit and broke her dentures and demanded $10, which was quite a lot of money in 1880, from the doctor to pay for the dentures. Well, he didn't want to do that for other patients, so he came up with different ways that people wouldn't have to bite into a hard biscuit. First, he ground it down, and it became little tiny, particles. He called that granola until somebody sued him because they had the name granola, and then they called it granos. And then they played around with batches of dough. Will and John did this for years, of how to cook it, boil it, bake it. So it was both dextrinized, it was easy to digest, but also palatable and reproducible, that you can make a lot of it. And they finally hit on flake cereal one day when they had a batch of dough, and it was, they had worked all weekend, they were very tired, and the doctor was either called away for a medical emergency or they just both wanted to just go to bed. And Will was very cheap, so he took that batch of dough and put it in a container overnight. And probably what happened is that the dough tempered. And tempering is a process where the water content in a dough evens out across the entire batch, and you don't get air bubbles. And it's a little moldy, but not too moldy that it alters the taste. Bakers know about this quite well, but they didn't. And then when they rolled it out very flat and baked it, and then they would cut little pieces off, they got perfect flakes. And so that's how wheat flakes or flake cereal were developed. And then Will went back to the lab and tried this batch and that batch and adding this or taking this out. And then eventually they came up with cornflakes.
Sure. And this was healthy at the time, right? Compared to the other ways that they were eating. I think it's interesting. Both of the brothers, in their pursuit with the sanitarium, and then ultimately with cornflakes, they were really kind of after this like American pursuit of wellness. They're kind of credited for this, and you talk about that a lot in the book. But when you mention the name Kellogg's today, again, bringing to present day, it's not necessarily synonymous with wellness, right?
Yeah.
I don't say John Kellogg or Will Kellogg, oh yeah, they've created this whole American movement of wellness. In fact, as I was talking to people about this talk today with you, and I mentioned the word Kellogg's, I would just kind of ask them, what do you think of when you hear Kellogg's? A lot of the responses are, Frosted Flakes,
Yep.
Frosted Mini Wheats, Pop Tarts, like all of these sugary treats. And now obviously that's probably a product of time, right? This is not something that they created initially.
Right.
So the name Kellogg's and wellness don't necessarily go completely together. What's the lasting legacy of all of this work that they put in to establish this base of American wellness and how it looks today? What do you think the legacy of the brothers is based on?
Well, a couple of things. First, I can tell your age because you call it Frosted Flakes and not Sugar Frosted Flakes, which is what they were called in the 1960s. And they are great. They are great. They're fantastic. That actually happened after Will died. In the mid-50s, there was another CEO who noticed, and particularly in the television era, that cartoon characters and sugary cereals sold like hotcakes, and of course they did. Will's cereals, he prided himself on knowing a lot about nutrition and making nutritious cereals. So his product line was basically cornflakes, Rice Krispies, and bran cereals, and later shredded wheat. And most of those, while they're not perfect cereals, we'd consider them healthier than the products you just mentioned. The doctor was against added sugar completely.
In any way, right?
In any way, he called them sugar inebriates, and so that was not; these were not ingredients that he would have advocated. And you know, the Kellogg's Food Company today is a conglomerate of I think 180 different brands.
Sure. And many of them very healthy.
Some healthy, some not. You know, and the other notion too, by the way, is that processed food, which today is sort of a dirty word,
chemically altered foods.
But then it represented the advent of modernity, because you took a product, corn, and you ran it through 5 miles of conveyor belts and baking and toasting and this and that, and it came out a completely different product, corn flakes, that does not exist in nature. You are processing and manufacturing food. And so at the time they were thought to be very healthy. What the company does to make their reputation healthier is up to them. I don't think, they have not asked me for advice. But the notion, if we think about wellness and a lot of products that the doctor advocated, including soy milk and almond milk and probiotics and the lifestyle he suggested, we may not think of his name, but we do think of his prescriptions all the time. And I think the doctor would have preferred to have been known for that, but was also enough of a zealot for his cause that he'd say, you know, it's okay as long as people are living healthier lives.
You talk a lot in the book too about, you talk about the legacy, and you mentioned this as well with some of the modernization of some of the foods that Kellogg's produces now, about kind of the movement that Will in particular started around just advertising in general, brand advertising, which we all know so well. A lot of us are in advertising here at Google, and so that struck a chord with me as well. He spent a lot of money on advertising when Corn Flakes and subsequent cereals came out. He was kind of spearheaded some of these ideas around jingles and catchphrases, and as you mentioned, cartoon characters. He also kind of had some early inclinations of how to kind of market cereals and foods in particular to children, with putting toys and cereal boxes. And
he invented the toy in the box.
A lot of that came from him, right? And it was obviously carried on and duplicated across the board. I think that's a really interesting concept too, is not only were they revolutionary in terms of food production and health and wellness, but also that extended into the business world as well.
It is incredible. What was so much fun about this book is that even though it's about two brothers in a small city, it's sort of like spokes on a wheel of American history at that time, and how Will seized on of advertising at that moment, 1906 on. It's just when 3 and 4 color printing is beginning, when linotype machines are being developed, when national magazines and newspapers are requiring advertisements to fill their pages, and his big demographic were basically children who would ask their mothers, and mothers were the other demographic who bought the food, and he advertised to both those demographics to a fairly well in all sorts of creative ways that we now take for granted. And he also was very early an advertiser on radio, then television, and I suspect on Google and the internet today.
Yeah.
So he was brilliant at that. Other things were happening in American industry too that helped Kellogg's become Kellogg's. You had a shift from coal burning factories to electrical powered factories. So you could start and stop your conveyor belt at the push of a button. You had all sorts of new machinery and conveyor belts and toasting ovens and so on. You had good railways that went across the country and had refrigerated cars. You had clean pasteurized milk that was just starting to be distributed in America at that time. And you can't have a roll of cornflakes unless you have some milk. Absolutely. So that was going on as well. You had the telephones. So Will could call up Iowa from his Battle Creek office and say, what's the corn production? What's going on? And you could instantly make your plans based on that. And so all these advents of new technologies occurred just when he was starting his company. And so while he was a creator of a great many things, he was also an early adopter of other people's technologies and improvements.
Yeah, we had talked too, so all of this information, this is all incredibly interesting stuff, and the book is quite thick and filled with lots of tidbits of information. We talked before we started, this idea that there's a lot of information out there about John, not so much about Will. A lot of the information in terms of biographic information and documentation around Will is tightly controlled by the Kellogg Foundation to this day, where you actually have to sign a release and potentially give, or not potentially, but actually give them some final editing rights to the information that you pull from those documents before they can be published. How did you gather so much information in terms of, again, you mentioned John, there's quite a bit of information, but with Will, how did you pull all of that information together? And you also mentioned at the beginning that this is a bit of a departure from your old work, or your previous work, in terms of working on some of the epidemics and some of the books that focus on that. So what was that process in terms of research look like for you in this book, and how did it differ from the other books that you've written?
Yeah, well, it is an issue that the Kellogg Foundation, which owns the Kellogg Will's papers,
sure,
and they're beautifully archived and lovingly kept. You can't get to them unless you sign such a release, and no serious writer or historian can do so. Fortunately, Will wrote thousands, millions of memos, which went to other people. You could get a sense of his advertising and work from the actual ads. And he sued a great many people and would be deposed.
Sure.
And there's just stacks of depositions that are taller than I am. And so you got a great sense of his life and who he was, how he spoke, how he fought with other people. So while it wasn't perfect, I could create a rounded portrayal of him. There are also memoirs of him by his grandson, privately printed memoirs that we have at the Bentley Library, so I was lucky to be able to get access to that. And there are a few biographies and such that had been written in the 50s. They're corporate biographies, but they were not unhelpful. They actually were very helpful. So how did I do this compared to my other books? In a very similar process.
Similar, yeah.
You find people or events that has a great paper trail, and not everyone keeps paper,
right,
particularly today, but even back then.
Yeah.
So you have to, when you design an experiment, you have to make sure the experiment can be done. And so if there's no archival material, you can't do that. Now, in this case, there was tons of archival material, even with the limitation we just discussed. And then you just jump in and you read paper, and the more paper you read, the more ideas you get. And it's sort of like swimming in a deep lake. You don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, and then suddenly, thankfully, at least in my experience, you have this moment, that's how it's going to be. And then I told this to my editor at the time when I was going to change the focus from just John Harvey Kellogg to the brothers. She goes, "Oh, I knew you were going to do that all the time." I said, "Well, you could have at least told me. You would have saved me about 8 months." But you, as a writer, you figure it out. I've always been very blessed with, I don't believe in writer's block. I believe in not wanting to write. I write every day, even if I throw it out. I'm always interested in reading about people and writing about them. And so the more you play with a topic, play is not the precise word,
sure,
the more you work with this the topic you've chosen, you figure it out. You figure it out. And it's this jigsaw puzzle work because you're trying to create, at least I do when I write books, I'm what's called a narrative historian. I really want to convey a story with a beginning, middle, and an end to my readers. These are the stories I like to read, and I hope my readers like them as well.
And with such a deeply researched book like the Kellogg's, I'm just curious myself, what's like the split of time you spent researching to time you spent writing? Because it seems like, I'm asking because it seems like you did a ton of research on this and digging through these stacks and not necessarily having access to Will's papers and having to go in a roundabout way to find other methods and reading through these piles of letters and depositions. Did that take longer than your previous books? Was there more research that went into this because of some of the slight difficulties in finding this? So what's like the time average on? I'm just curious as to what that might look like.
Well, my first book was about 2 epidemics in 1892, within 7 months of each other, and it took me 7 years to write. That was my first. But even though there was a lot of research done, it wasn't a long period of time. And this book was my longest and most complicated book because it covers almost 100 years of history, from about 1830 to actually more than 100 years to about 1951. And there's a great many changes that are going on. So first you get the paper, first you get the archival materials, and then you start reading it, either on microfilm or I like the hard copy. And then you start taking notes and thinking about things and reading more and reading more. It took me about 2 years of just reading paper. And then I figured out where I was going, and then I started writing it. Now, I'm a rewriter. I write things over and over and over again. And, for people out there who want to be a writer, I became a published writer when I started rewriting. And I rewrite things 10, 20, 30, 40 times, probably even more.
Wow.
And I will play with a sentence, and I'm just lucky that I enjoy that. I actually like playing with sentences and trying to make things more clear or more exciting or more interesting. And so it took another 3 odd years to write. But actually, this book from start to finish took only 5 years. And I told you that first book 20 years ago or 25 years ago, it took 7. So maybe I'm getting better at it. I don't know.
Did your writing style have to change for this book since it was a bit of a departure from these stories of epidemics? Did you change your writing style, or did you keep the same style, just change the story a little bit?
I think the latter. I mean, if you're... you can't help but create a writing style if you write a great deal, and I do. I mean, I wrote for the New York Times for 10 years, and now I write for PBS NewsHour, and I wrote for Science Friday for many years, and I've written many books, and I also have written for academic audiences as well as a professor. And over a period of time, you develop a way of expressing yourself.
Sure.
And I think I've gotten better at that. I feel a greater command of the pen, so to speak, on this, my 8th or 9th book. I've lost count than I was, 20 years ago.
Sure.
I feel I know is what I'm doing, but the process is very similar. It's never really changed, and what also has never changed. I bring as much joy to my desk in the morning this morning as I did 25 years ago.
That's great. What's next? I don't mean to rush you along. I know this book I believe it came out in mid-2017. So
yeah, it came out in last summer.
Summer, yeah. So we're about 12 months past release. Are you working on something? Are you taking time off? You said you're always writing, so that's
I start a book as soon as I finish one.
Almost immediately. Yeah. Never ending.
It's a magnificent obsession.
Yeah. Can you share with us?
Yeah, sure. It's funny. Whenever you do a book talk, by the way, invariably the question is, what's next?
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about this book.
Yeah, I saved it for the end, but you had mentioned I write every day, and sometimes I throw it away, and I just wondered that actually kind of connected the question. Is there something that's come out of that writing?
I'm just starting a new book now on the discovery of the structure of DNA, and which is a great story.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough in October to be a research fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio.
Yeah,
I love
saw
saying
that,
I was
yeah.
in Bellagio.
Yeah.
And I started.
Not the casino in Las Vegas.
No,
You're talking about
the
Lake
real one,
Como
the
in
Lake
Italy,
Como,
right? Yes,
and
okay.
the view from my room.
Both very beautiful, but
Oh, the view I had
Yeah.
from my room was just incredible. And I would read. I thought to myself, "What's next?" And I thought of writing a long, big book of American medical history, but it was too choppy and episodic. And as I was saying, I'm a narrative historian, and I don't. It's sort of like the equivalent of a short story collection, as opposed to a novel, when you're telling a longer type of a story. And I thought to myself, well, are there any light switch moments that everyone sort of understands that changed everything in terms of how we understand the human body? Because I'm a physician and a historian of medicine. And I had just taught to my medical students before I left. We have a class I call Great Papers instead of Great Books.
Yeah, sure.
And we take great papers from the history of medicine and talk about them and what the context, the historical times were, and so on. And we read the Watson and Crick paper from Nature in 1953, which is an amazingly short paper. It's 900 words. And there's not a scintilla of data. It's all theory. It was the work of Wilkins and Franklin that did the X-ray crystallography studies that proved Watson and Crick's theory correct about the double helix. And then there's several books about the double helix, mostly by participants. And the more I read, I thought this really needs a more fully rounded historical account. And my literary agent and my publisher agreed, which is always a good feeling.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'll be in a couple of weeks. I'll be meeting with Dr. Watson to interview him. So I'm just thrilled to have that chance. And of course, I've been going through the archives quite a bit. I was in England for about a month and a half at Cambridge, where they did their work, and a lot of the participants' papers are, as well as London. And I'll be going to Cold Spring Harbor, where Dr. Watson's papers are, and then I'll get to Dr. Crick's papers, which are in San Diego.
Yeah.
So I'm having a ball, and I just started it.
Yeah. So you're early in that research phase of just absorbing as much as you can and trying to figure out where the story takes you.
Exactly. And somebody once asked, well, what part of writing a book do you like? And I like them all.
Yeah.
And so I like this phase that I'm doing. Writing is not, there's this romantic view. When I go to a party, people, well, I have a book in me, and I often think, well, maybe that's where it should stay. And but writing is, it's hard work, but it's wonderful work. And so I love the writing, I love the rewriting, I love the editing process, working with a good editor. I love when it's set in galleys and you can start to see what it's looking like. Yeah. I love talking about it once it's done. So it beats a real job any day of the week. It's been a really good career.
That's awesome. Well, we'll have to have you back in when the next book comes out.
Yeah, give me a couple years. Yeah.
Call us in a few years when it's ready to go.
I will.
We'll get you back in.
Great.
Well, listen, thank you, Dr. Markel. Thank you for sharing. Like I said, the book is fantastic. I really enjoyed it front to back. I really did. Very historically relevant and also relevant to what's going on today. There's so many pages where I was like, oh, this is tying so many things together for me that I hadn't known, from health and wellness all the way to pop culture. Very interesting across the board. Thanks for sharing. Best of luck with everything moving forward, the research phase. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.